wanted to just highlight some numbers here. This Amy Vanderpool, who has been a guest on this program numerous times, does a newsletter called Shero, S-H-E-R-O. You can easily find it by looking for her Twitter feed or Googling Shero, S-H-E-R-O. I'm sorry, I don't have her URL right off the top of my head, but it's easy to find. And every week in her and I subscribe to her newsletter, and I encourage others to as well. It's a Substack newsletter. And every week she documents on Saturdays or Sundays the mass shootings of the previous week. And I just wanted to share this with you. This is my source on this is Amy Vanderpool's Shero newsletter. She says in the last week there were 17 separate mass shooting incidents in the United States. 20 people were killed, 73 were injured. On Sunday, September 19th, there was a mass shooting in Rochester, New York. There was a mass shooting in Chicago, Illinois. There was a mass shooting in Oakland, California. There was a mass shooting in Dallas, Texas. There was a mass shooting in Miami, Florida. And there was a mass shooting in Yamasee, South Carolina. On Monday, September 20th, this is last week, Monday, September 20th, there was a mass shooting in St. Louis, Missouri. There was a mass shooting in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. And there was a mass shooting in Washington, D.C. On Wednesday of last week, there was a mass shooting in Fayetteville, North Carolina. On Thursday of last week, there were mass shootings in Collierville, Tennessee, and Philadelphia, Pennsylvania. On Friday of last week, there were mass shootings in Los Angeles and Aiken, South Carolina. And on Saturday of last week, so this must be her Sunday newsletter. On Saturday of last week, there were mass shootings in Athens, Tennessee, Riverside, California, and Utica, New York. Now, how many mass shootings were there in, say, all of Germany? Probably none. All of France? I don't know, but probably none. One single mass shooting in Japan or in Australia or, makes international headlines. We had 17 of them last week in the United States. 17 mass shootings. We are becoming absolutely numb to mass shootings and violence in the United States. And this is not a healthy place to be. This is not a healthy circumstance to be living in, numb to mass shootings. And frankly, we really don't have the power and influence of the NRA anymore. I realize the big weapons manufacturers are now going directly to many of the legislators that the NRA previously owned. The NRA kind of just, sank in their own corruption. Wayne LaPierre and his yacht and all that kind of stuff. But this is what you get when you allow an industry, in this case the weapons industry, to create a front group that literally reinvented the history of America, to say that the Second Amendment was passed so that average Americans could have a gun to defend themselves, and thus everybody should have a gun, when in fact the Second Amendment was passed in part because some of the founders and framers felt that we should not have a standing army during time of peace, and so every state should have a militia that could be called up if the country was ever invaded, number one. And number two, that specifically Virginia and South Carolina were hysterical that Article 1, Section 8 of the Constitution, of the proposed Constitution, allowed the president, the federal government, to call up the state militias. And they were really, really worried that if their state militias, which were also their slave patrols, were called up by an anti-slavery president, that without the slave patrols, there would be slave uprisings in their states. And they had seen this in 1802 or 3 or 8 in the first decade of the 1800s in Haiti. It's like they were, well, actually, at the time of the ratification of the Constitution, that had not yet happened. But they had seen slave uprisings across the United States hundreds and hundreds of times. It was not something that was unknown to them. And so the NRA completely reinvented the history of the Second Amendment, which was not controversial until the 70s when they decided to do this. and got the Supreme Court to ratify it with lots and lots of lobbying and money, and then sold hundreds of millions of guns to Americans, and we end up with 17 mass shootings in 1 week. More than the rest of the developed world has probably in a 3-month period. And it doesn't even make the newspapers. It takes Amy Vanderpool documenting it in her Shero newsletter every weekend. There's something seriously wrong here. And again, it goes back to the Supreme Court saying money in politics is just First Amendment protected free speech.